Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing some music themed card magic using two different collections from Hero Arts. We have the vintage vinyl collection as well as the cool Yule collection. That first Stampin' Cut set was the Wishing You Stampin' Cut. This is the Feeling Festive Stampin' Cut. Some great stamps as well as sentiments. And then we have the Twinkle Toes stencil. I'm going to create a few different backgrounds and a couple different color palettes with that layering stencil set. Then we have the solid gold Stampin' Cut as well as the vintage vinyl Stampin' Cut. So these are great collections that work well together, or you could easily use them individually. I'm going to start by creating a few cards with the cool Yule, which is the first three things. The Wishing You Stampin' Cut, the Feeling Festive Stampin' Cut, as well as the Twinkle Toes stencil set. Then I'm going to create two with the vintage vinyl collection, which is the solid gold Stampin' Cut and the vintage vinyl Stampin' Cut. Now I wanted to create a few backgrounds with this Twinkle Toes stencil with a few different color palettes. So I'm using just some Hammermill cardstock and I'm layering my stencils on top of the Hammermill cardstock. Now I like to use some painter's tape in order to create just registration marks on the top left part of my stencil and the bottom right of my stencil. It doesn't need to be on all four corners. If you got the top like opposite corners, you can just line up those two corners and you're good to go. So my first color palette for my background is going to be blues. So I have some Broken China and some Mermaid Lagoon. Now this layering stencil set has 3 layers to it, but for the third layer, I'm going to be using some Moon Dust Stickles Glitter Gel. The third layer is kind of little stars to go in this diamond pattern, and I thought it would be fun to add some sparkle as well as texture to that layer. Now I'm using 2 different shades of blue. You could easily use just one if you wanted and be heavier handed with one of the layers than the other if you wanted to add some color variation and make it look like you have 2 different shades, but only be using one shade of ink. I'm also using some large blender brushes from Spellbinders. This just makes the backgrounds go so super easy. Now the one thing with these layers though, because they're kind of stripes, these zigzag layers to create the diamonds, they do wiggle around just a little bit. So you'd want to be a little bit gentle with your brush when you're doing that layering stenciling or that stenciling. Now this is the third layer. I'm just going to use that Moon Dust Stickles Glitter Gel. I want to try to get as little of it on my sticky mat as possible. So I'm just using some printer paper in order to mask off my mat. It will wash off when it's wet, but some of those little glitter pieces really like to stick to that mat, and it's easier to just avoid getting it on there. So I'm using a palette knife to get it onto my stencil as cleanly as possible. Any excess can go right back into the jar simply because I haven't used any ink on this layer. And then I can lift up that stencil. We want to make sure we lift it while it's wet. We don't want to let that stencil dry on there. And we've got some beautiful sparkle as well as texture from that last layer. Now you want to make sure to clean off that stencil as well as your palette knife as soon as possible. You don't want to let that gel dry on there. So in between each and every background that I'm creating, I am cleaning off my stencil and completely drying it. So for my next layer, I'm doing 2 reds. So I have Festive Berries and Lumberjack Plaid, and I'm doing one for each different layer. Now you can see by my stenciling, some areas are lighter, some areas are darker. I do that intentionally. I think it makes it look a little bit more interesting personally. If you want it to be all one layer or one amount or one concentration of ink, you can absolutely do this. For this last layer here, I chose to use some of the gold ink from the Lisa Horton Crafts metallic ink pads. And first I do the gold ink in this last layer, then I wipe my stencil off with a microfiber cloth and then go back in with that Moon Dust Stickles Glitter Gel. So we still get that sparkle. The glitter gel is transparent, so we're not going to cover any of that gold up. We're basically changing the color of that Stickles glitter gel. So we're going to see that gold ink underneath it, and I thought it was just a nice accent to change it up just a little bit from that first background. Now I did clean off my stencil with that dry microfiber cloth. There might be just a little bit of ink on there, but that way I'm not lifting up as much ink as if I had left it on its own. So when I'm doing that glitter gel, I'm trying to make sure not to use too much. I just want it so that it is even with the top of the stencil. I don't want it to be heaped over top. The more that you have on there, the longer it's going to take to dry. So I do let these backgrounds dry for probably a good hour, maybe it was an hour and a half, just to make sure that they're totally dry before before we continue on with our card making. For the last background, I'm doing Mowed Lawn and Twisted Citron. So once again, lining up those two corners with the stencil, doing one color on one layer of the stencil and the second color on the second layer. Now you can even get more creative with this and just use, say, one of these layers for your backgrounds for something just a little bit different. You could try to create, say, a plaid with them. I'm not sure how it would look. I didn't actually do it, but it might create kind of a funky background. I just like that these they kind of create a bit of a diamond background, a diamond stripe background. I think it looks really interesting. And then you don't even have to put that last layer on if you don't want, or you could put that last layer on with just ink if you wanted to only have the ink on there. Now I do put that last layer on here. Now here's where I erred from what I had intended. I had intended to layer this layer on and then put some silver ink on those stars before putting my Moondust Stickles glitter gel. Completely forgot, just got lost in the process, and then realized it when I had half the thing filled up with the glitter gel that I had forgotten to add that silver layer, because I wanted my backgrounds to all have something a little bit different with them. So this one is really pretty similar to that first background, other than the fact that we have two different colors to it. It still looks fabulous. I still really like it, but I had intended to put silver ink on there just to make those little starburst pieces stand out just a little bit more with that glitter gel. So I set those off to the side, making sure to clean off my stencils from that glitter gel, and also drying those stencils before starting my next step here. So I haven't used these stamp sets before, so the very first thing that I do is I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. This just helps to remove any possible manufacturing residue, helps the stamp take ink just a little bit better. This one is the Feeling Festive Stampin' Cut. And I'm going to do the record player as well, as there's a little album cover, and then I'm going to do one of the sentiments for this set for one of my cards. I'm using some vintage photo distress ink for the base part of my record player. Now I want my record that's playing in the center of this record player to have some shine to it. So I'm going to heat emboss it with black embossing powder. Now if I were to just stamp that and add the embossing powder now, it would stick to that vintage vinyl or that vintage photo distress ink on there, because there is resins in that ink that makes it dry a little bit slower. So what I do is I put a little bit of embossing powder tool on that ink and absorb any of the wetness from that ink before I go and stamp that record with the Versamark ink, the embossing ink. So I make sure that I'm really generous with that embossing powder tool so that my ink is not wet anymore. Now you can always test it by just putting some embossing powder over top of that, just to make sure that none of the powder is sticking to that. I omitted that step because I was pretty confident that I had added enough of that embossing powder tool. Then I stamped that record in the center of the record player with some Versamark ink, poured the black embossing powder on there, and then I'm heat embossing that powder. There is a stamp to do some details in the center of that record player. Now you could just use a tiny stamping block and stamp those in there, or you could bring the Misti back out again and position that and then do it. The stamp kept sticking to my fingers, so it was hard to get it positioned exactly right. Sometimes if you wet your fingers, that will help, but it just wasn't cooperating with this. So it might just be easier just to pull out a tiny stamp block and just stamp that center. It's just a kind of a curved line and then a dot for the center of that record. So it's not a stamp that you need to have perfect pristine placement or perfect pristine stamping if you're worried about that. Now there is another stamp that has some detail pieces for this record player. So I am stamping those with Versamark ink, and then I'm going to heat emboss those as well so that they have a different finish from the base of the record player. So I stamp that with that Versamark ink. I'm using some gold embossing powder so that the handle, that some of the buttons and the record, I don't know what the needle is called. I think it's called the needle. That is going to be gold, and there is a die that coordinates with that to cut those pieces out. There is a couple pieces in that stamp that actually don't get cut out from the die, and I'm not really sure what those are. When I grew up, we had records as kids, but I can't say I paid enough attention to know all of the pieces of a record player or records themselves, because they kind of got phased out when I was fairly young-ish. So I don't know the names of them. So next I'm going to stamp the little album cover. Now I didn't want it to be completely blue because there is a Santa hat that I want to stamp in the center of it, and I didn't want to be stamping the red over top of the blue. So I just put my pad on the edges of the straight edges of that stamp. So we got the hint of the blue around it and it kind of fades into white. Then I can go and stamp that hat. And for the hat, there is two pieces. There is the solid piece for the red part of the hat, and then there is an outline piece for the fur of the hat. So I'm going to heat emboss that fur for that hat with some silver embossing powder. That way it shows up on the white cardstock, but we still get a different detail color from the red hat and of course the blue background. So I used some Versamark ink with that, and you could see that I did put some embossing powder tulle on the blue ink before doing that because I wanted to make sure that that silver ink was only going to be sticking to the Versamark ink and not that blue ink. And that blue ink was just tumbled glass distress ink, or sorry, broken china distress ink. That was one of the ink colors that I used for one of my backgrounds when I did the backgrounds with the Twinkle Toes stencil set. So once we have that outline piece heat embossed, we can line up the solid piece in the middle, and that one I'm going to be inking with some Lumberjack Plaid. Super simple, just colors in that center there. You could even just use a pen to color it in because it's a really simple shape, but it's easy enough to line up that stamp itself and stamp it. So now that we have all of those pieces done, we can die cut them. So this set has coordinating dies that go with each one of those pieces. So I'm going to tape those in place with a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape to make sure that those pieces, those dies, do not move on me while I'm doing my die cutting. Nothing worse than lining something up and it moves on you while you're doing your die cutting, especially after you have a stamped image like this that takes a few different stamps to line up and stamp them together. So these are going to go over top of one of my stenciled backgrounds just as little accent pieces. And I love the fact that there's so many different choices in that stamp set that give you lots of options for your cards that are perfect for music lovers. So once we have those pieces stamped, we are ready to start assembling our first card. So I'm just pushing all of those bits out. Now I want to add the detail bits to my suitcase, or to my record player before I add it to the front of the card. Really, you could do this step after starting to assemble the card if you want, but by putting all of those small pieces on that record player, we just have one piece to worry about rather than having a bunch of little pieces as well to keep track of. So here are those adorable little pieces. I'm going to set those to the side. Now I realized that I hadn't actually stamped a sentiment to this. So I'm going to use my scrap hammer mill cardstock here, and I'm going to stamp and heat emboss a sentiment. The one that I chose to do was Have a Cool Yule, which I thought worked well with that record player as well as the album, and it also works perfect for this whole collection. So I stamped it with some Versamark ink. I poured some gold embossing powder on there. Now when I'm doing sentiments, I do try to use super fine gold embossing powder. It just gives you a little bit more detail. If you only have regular, that will absolutely work as well. We used regular for years before superfine was even a thing, but I do find that superfine just gives you a lot more precise detail when you're creating some sentiments. So once that is heat embossed, I'm going to line up the die, tape it in place once again, and then we're going to start assembling our card. Now I'm going to do this on the red background. I thought the red background was perfect because we have that little bit of red for the Santa hat, so it coordinates with that and it will show off those pieces nicely. So I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock that I trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My stenciled background I trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I'm going to take this piece of hammer mill cardstock and I'm going to make it coordinate with the rest of my design here. So I'm using that gold Lisa Horton pad and just rubbing it around the edges of the cardstock. If you have some gold pearl cardstock, that will absolutely work as well. This is just a super quick, easy way to create some gold cardstock for a mat very, very easily and very simply. And this way you can save your specialty cardstock for those little die cut pieces. This has just a beautiful shine to it and it looks just like specialty cardstock. No one would ever know, but it's a super simple way to use an inexpensive cardstock and just kind of elevate it. So I added my sentiment to the top and then I put my record player and my album towards the bottom. Now because we have those sparkles or the sprinkles, little star pieces with that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel, it has some dimension to it. So once I've glued it together, I put my large acrylic block on there to let it dry for a few moments to kind of have it grab. And then I put a little bit of stickles on the fur part of the hat on the album. Then I set that aside to dry so that I could work on my next card while that was drying. But it just adds that little bit of sparkle to the album piece and has it coordinating with the sparkle that is on the background. So for the next card here, I'm going to be using the Wishing You stamp and cut. I am stamping these on some scrap pieces of hammer mill cardstock. Anytime I have stamps that are smaller than some of my scrap pieces, I try to use those pieces up as much as possible. Now for this, I have this sentiment here and I want to heat emboss them with some silver embossing powder. So this works perfectly on that little scrap. I put some of that embossing powder tool on the cardstock, stamped it with some Versamark ink. And I do stamp it a couple times. This is the great thing about using Stamp Positioner or the Misti stamping tool is you can stamp in exactly the same spot multiple times and know that your stamp is going to be in the same spot. Now I said I was doing this in silver, but I just realized I did it in gold. I poured that gold embossing powder on there and then heat embossed those. Now these do have coordinating dies to them, so we're going to cut those out with the coordinating dies. Once again, taping them in place with a little bit of Best Ever Craft tape. And that tape I reuse over and over again. So I will reuse them a good half a dozen times before they really just don't want to stick anymore. That way I get a lot of use out of that tape, and that roller tape goes a really long way. So these two collections, the vintage vinyl is more of a birthday themed music. It's got a lot of different sentiments. It doesn't really have any images to it, but you'll see what I do with that to make it work just on its own. And then the cool Yule, it's got a music theme to it, but it's more Christmas music theme. So they're fun to use together, but you can easily use them on their own if you want as well. So for this card, with the sentiments that I have heat embossed from the set, I'm going to create a record on the front of the card. And I pulled in my Infinity Circles die set, and I'm using a couple of the circles from it. So I did one in some rainforest cardstock, and I just cut it a little bit larger than my sentiment here. I'm going to really quickly color in some of the image parts of the sentiment. It's got some holly and berries. So I used a green Copic G07, and then I used a red Copic R17, and I'm just going to super quickly color those in just to give it that little bit of color. You can color it however you want. These are teeny tiny areas, so it doesn't have to be intricate coloring in any way, shape, or form. Then I added a little bit of color to that banner there. So I used EOO, again, just to give it a little bit of shading, just to take it to the next level and have it have a little bit of color to it. You don't have to necessarily add the color to it. You could always use like an ink blending brush and just do some ink blending around it if you want. For my mat, I have some rainforest cardstock that I've trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And yes, you can see that I've die cut out of the center of it. Just because you have die cut out of your cardstock doesn't mean that you can't use it as a mat. Once we have those other pieces on top of there, they're going to cover those openings in the center. And it's just a great way to make your cardstock go a little bit farther. So once again, my stenciled background was trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I added that to the center. I have a large circle here cut out of some Raven cardstock that I'm going to create the look of a record from. So we're gluing that a little bit off to the side for just something a little bit more interesting. Now here's where I was saying earlier that you have to, when we have a background with that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel, you need to let it dry for just a few moments because you need to make sure that you let it grab that raised part of the background. And you can see that my record here is moving just a little bit because I hadn't added quite enough glue. So I go back in and add just a little bit more generous with it. We want to make sure that that has good contact with our background. Then for the center, I have that sentiment with the circle that I cut out and glued onto the rainforest cardstock. Spellbinders has some really new fun spinners that we're going to add to the center of that record so that that part spins. Now it would be fun also to have the record spinning, but because my record is larger than the card, I thought it would look a little bit odd having something that large spinning, and I definitely wanted to cut off the excess from the side of the card so it would fit into a regular A2 envelope. But I think this has the fun spinning of a record, but a little bit smaller size and fits within the parameters of that card. So I just added a little bit of stickles to the berries there. Again, they don't cover any of the color of the berries. They just add that texture and sparkle to it. So I'm going to set those off to the side, and we're going to pick a few stamps for our next card here. So this one is going to have Copic colored image of Santa and Mrs. Claus dancing. And then we also have our sentiments here, and those ones I'm going to heat emboss with silver embossing powder. So I used some black memento ink for my Santa and Mrs. Claus image because I do want to color that with Copic, and that is my favorite way, or my favorite ink to stamp with when I'm coloring with Copic markers. Another option here would be to put this onto some watercolor cardstock and watercolor those images. For my sentiments, I do want to heat emboss them because I really love the look of heat emboss sentiments, especially when it comes to holiday cards. This is going to have that blue background to it. It's going to show off the reds for Santa and Mrs. Claus's outfits really, really well. And it's also going to coordinate nicely with the silver embossed sentiments here. So anytime you're embossing, if you have embossing powder where you don't want it to go, before heat embossing it, make sure you use a soft brush and brush those little crystals away. Once you've used your heat tool and melted that powder into the paper, there's no way you're going to get it off or get it removed. So do that before time. And you could see that I had a few grains where I didn't want them to go, so I just brushed them off really easily. So for the reds for Santa and Mrs. Claus's outfit, I'm using R17 and R37. Now, typically when I color with Copics, I'll do the light color first, then the dark color, and then go back and blend with the light color. I decided to play around this time. I've seen some videos where some people do the dark color first and then go blend in with the lighter color. So I opted to try that for this video. I often forget to actually try it. The first way is the way that I was taught and the way that I'm most familiar with. This way absolutely works. It just takes one of the steps away from it. So I would recommend, if you're trying Copics out or alcohol-based markers out, try them both ways and see what works best for you. What works for one person isn't necessarily what works best for another person. So I always recommend trying different ways just to see for yourself which way you like best. It's always fun that different people do things in different ways, and it's fun to be able to try those different ways, because you might try a new way that you've been doing it one way your entire life, and all of a sudden this new way makes way more sense. Or you can try the other way and say, no, I like mine better. I do it this way because blah, 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 blah. So definitely try it out. For the black for Santa's boots as well as his belt and his gloves, I'm using some Copic 100. Sometimes I'll use a really dark gray, but here I decided there's not too much black, so I didn't mind using the 100. For the skin, I used EOO. I also used R17 for Mrs. Claus's shoes. Then I went and did E35 for Mrs. Claus's hair. This is a super simple image for coloring. The only color, or the only place that I did some blending with lights and darks is the outfits. The rest of the areas are really too small. They didn't have enough room to do any blending with. But I do love using Copic markers because they blend together so nice and easily, and you also don't have that paper that starts to pill. Now for the belt buckle on Santa's clothes, I did some gold gel pen just to add that gold accent to it. I always love buckles in that gold color. So I die cut those pieces, and now we're ready to start assembling our cards. So once again, I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock stock that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. The stenciled background is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. This time I'm using the Lisa Horton silver pad to go around the outside edges for my mat. It's going to coordinate nicely with the silver sentiments that we have, as well as the Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel works really, really well with silver. So we're going to glue this onto our A2 card base. I use Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. It works perfectly for gluing tiny die cuts together or gluing large areas together. I like the liquid glue because it gives you that bit of wiggle room to grab and shimmy in place. So I think it has a lot of it's easier to use than tape that you have to get it right the first time. On my sentiments, I'm using that silver ink pad and just lightly putting it around the outside edges so that they have a little bit of framing on them. And once again, because we have the star pieces or the stars in the background with that Moon Dust Stickles glitter gel, and that's raised, we want to give this just a little bit of extra time to grab that lower area, the base, and make sure that our pieces are stuck to it. I realized while I was waiting for that to dry that I had forgotten to color in Mrs. Claus's legs, so I did that with the EOO. And then I added a little bit of stickles to the fur lining on their outfits. Now this is just going to coordinate with that stickles in the background. I always love doing fur with stickles though, because I love that extra texture and I love that extra sparkle that it gives to it. Another option here is if you have Fun Flock from years ago. It is really fun to use Stickles and then pour Fun Flock on it because you get that glitter and then you also get that little furry, fuzzy texture with it. But Fun Flock isn't really a thing anymore. So for the last two cards, I'm going to be using the vintage vinyl stamp sets. Now I wanted to create some shaped cards for this. So I took my Infinity Circles die set and used the largest one. For each card, I cut one out of classic white cardstock and one out of Raven cardstock. I wanted to make sure that when you open the card, you could easily write on the inside of the card. I used my trimmer to trim just a hair off of one side of the circle, and then the opposite side of the circle, I scored it using my score pal at about 3.5 inches. Made sure that that fold mark had a really nice hinge to it, and then I glued that top part to the back part of my black circle. So the black circle I didn't trim anything off of. I only trimmed it off of the back side so that it would have a little bit of a flat edge to stand nicely. Because of that flat edge, we're not going to have circle cards that are going to roll. They're going to stand really nicely and they're going to be nice and secure. You don't have to do it on the front as well because we already have that security on the back. So for the first card, I'm going to be using the vintage vinyl stamp set, and I'm using that Happy Birthday to You, that one right at the top corner there. The outside part says something about here's to another turn around the sun or something to that effect. I liked those two together, and I'm going to put these on the center part of the circle. Now I keep both of these cards super simple and only use the stamps from the vintage vinyl and the solid gold Stampin' Cuts, but you could always add like balloons, or you could add some flowers if you wanted to get them to get a little bit more intricate or a little bit more textured. You could add that. I chose to keep them super simple and have them just look like records with birthday sentiments in the center. So I'm once again using some scrap pieces of Hammermill cardstock. I'm heat embossing these with some Mermaid Lagoon Distress Glaze. I love the Distress Glazes because they have colors that are similar to the Distress inks, but they have just a beautiful vibrancy as well as a nice shine to them. They're a great alternative if you want to emboss something without black, white, or metallic. So I do love using the glazes when I want something to be bright and vibrant. So once I've heat embossed those, I'm going to use the coordinating dies to die cut those pieces out. I am going to put this on the center of the card. Now I glue them all flat, but if you wanted to add a little bit of dimension, you could use some foam pop dots for the center, that HB2U. It would be great if it was popped up as well. I opted not to, but I just wanted to share that option that you could add that extra dimension there if you wanted. Now to off camera, I die cut another circle from some Rainforest cardstock to add a little bit more color to this one here. This is also going to just give you a base piece for the center of the record. You could do this in white if you didn't want it to show up as much, but I really like that extra pop of color, especially for a birthday card. Things that are nice and vibrant, I think work really well. So definitely when you're going to add these center pieces, you want to make sure that you have that little background white piece that has that that piece cut off the bottom on the bottom of your card. You want to make sure that you're orientating all of these pieces right so that when you stand this up on your mantle or on your desk or whatnot, you have the sentiment faced correctly. So for the next card, I'm going to use the solid gold Stampin' Cut. Now for this one, I'm going to stamp my sentiments on some red cardstock. I have some poppy cardstock here. I have it just using a scrap piece of poppy cardstock. Now I wanted to do this with gold on that poppy cardstock for just a little bit of a different color palette. Again, something nice and bright, but I love the look of the gold with that red. I think it's really pretty. And I just glue these flat to those circle shaped card bases, but you could, if you wanted to pull those Spellbinder spinners back in, you could put these little centerpieces on spinners. It would add that extra bit of dimension, that little bit of movement to your card. The one thing to note with those spinners though is, especially with these particular cards, you want to make sure that that spinner is exactly center. Otherwise, the heavier part will face the bottom. So if it's not exactly center, it might not sit right without having spun it. And you want to make sure that you have your sentiments obviously standing correctly when you're not using it. So do you want to make sure that that is completely centered? If you noticed on the A2 card that I added that, when I spun it, you could see that it wasn't exactly precisely centered. It had one area that was just a little bit bigger. For that particular card, I don't think it really mattered. But for this one here, if you're going to stand it onto a mantle or a desk or whatnot, you want to make sure that those sentiments stand properly. So I have a white piece of cardstock that I cut out 2 different circle shapes. The smaller one I'm going to add my sentiments to. The larger one I'm going to use that gold ink pad and just quickly add that ink around the outside of that piece there. Again, super simple to color your cardstock using these ink pads. They've got some beautiful color to them and the ink dries fairly quickly, but it's a great way to just extend your specialty cardstocks by using just some plain and expensive cardstock for that. So I glued those 2 pieces together and we're ready to add those to the front of the card. So the very first step is to make sure I have that flat part of my back of my card facing the bottom, and then we're going to add that center there. And again, I kept it super simple for these cards, but you could always add more things to it if you wanted. I just love the simplicity of this, just love the look of it just looking like a record with the sentiment on the inside of it. Again, a super simple card to make, but you could make it more elaborate if you want, and you can do whatever color palette you want. You can get really creative with the color palettes and really customize it to the recipient. So again, another circle shaped card, perfect for a music lover or a record lover. Then we have our cards created using the cool Yule collection here. We have Santa and Mrs. Claus dancing against that stenciled background. And that stenciled background has that beautiful sparkle on the background thanks to that Moondusticles glitter gel. Then we have our card with the record with the spinner in the center of that record there. Now, all of the supplies that I've used will be listed and linked down in the description box below. So if there's something that I've forgotten to mention, you'll likely find the answers there. Then we have our very first card with that stenciled background and the record and the album. Again, great cards for holiday ones, for music lovers, or for throughout the year. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.